In the darkness between the stars, something began to count. Light pulsed from an interstellar visitor in a rhythm too elegant to be chance. 11235813, the same sequence that shapes galaxies, seashells, and the spiral of life itself. As telescopes captured the pattern, the sun responded with matching flares, as if the universe were listening. Radio observatories joined in, recording whispers that moved in perfect synchrony across the sky. Was this coincidence or communication written in the mathematics of creation? What began as a flicker in the void soon revealed something far greater, a hidden geometry that connects all things from light to life. Tonight, we follow the trail of numbers from the first pulse to the final echo, and ask the question no one is ready to answer. What if the universe has been speaking all along and we have only just learned to listen? It began with a flicker so faint that most observatories missed it. A small cluster of light patterns emerging from the interstellar visitor known as 3I Atlas. At first, it seemed like an ordinary variation in brightness, the kind caused by surface rotation or outgassing jets reflecting sunlight. But the rhythm refused to behave like anything natural. The intervals between the pulses were not random. They followed a sequence, one that anyone who has ever studied the mathematics of life would recognize instantly. 11235813. The Fibonacci sequence. The first researcher to notice this pattern was part of a small amateur astronomy network in Chile. They checked their data against international observatories, expecting the noise to vanish under professional scrutiny. It did not. Instead, the larger the sample became, the more distinct the sequence appeared. Each burst of light lasted precisely the duration predicted by Fibonacci ratios. The odds of this happening through random cosmic flicker were nearly impossible. Something was pulsing with mathematical intent. When scientists first ran the signal through frequency filters, they expected interference. Solar radiation, instrument drift, or even reflections from Earth's atmosphere could create illusions of order. But the pattern survived every correction. The timing was exact to microseconds. That precision spoke of something aware of both scale and symmetry. Natural randomness does not count to 13 and then reset itself. Some proposed that the pattern could arise from rotational harmonics. If the object's surface had multiple active jets venting gas at uneven intervals, they might combine into a repeating rhythm. Yet simulations failed to reproduce the sequence. They produced uneven patterns, chaotic bursts, but never the clean spiral of Fibonacci mathematics. The same ratios that define the curves of galaxies and the spirals of Nautilus shells were now echoing in light from a visitor between the stars. This was when the tone of discussion began to shift. What if this was not an accident of rotation but a transmission? A deliberate signal encoded in brightness rather than sound. For decades, scientists have speculated that the first form of extraterrestrial communication might come as mathematical pulses, since numbers are universal. A civilization aware of Fibonacci ratios would be showing recognition of the same laws that shape the universe, but the implications were difficult to accept. If this was communication, it was not in a form designed for our eyes alone. It could be a multi-layered broadcast, visible light for some receivers, radio harmonics for others. The idea gained momentum when cross-correlation tests revealed faint radio echoes at the exact moments of the optical pulses. The synchronization was uncanny. It was as if the signal was broadcasting across multiple dimensions of energy. Some observers noted that the pulses intensified during certain alignments between the Sun and Earth, as if they responded to specific geometries. Others dismissed it as coincidence, but the timing was consistent enough to raise a question. Was 3I Atlas reacting to our star or using it? If light could carry coded ratios, perhaps the Sun's own radiation could serve as a relay. After all, the Fibonacci sequence is not just a pattern. It is the geometry of expansion. It defines the growth of plants, the structure of hurricanes, the spin of spiral galaxies. To find it in the pulses of an interstellar object felt like discovering language written into the fabric of reality itself, mathematicians began exploring whether the light intervals could correspond to more complex structures such as the golden ratio. When one pulse was divided by the duration of the previous, the result hovered close to 1.618, the same number that defines beauty in art, architecture, and even DNA. It was too elegant, too structured to ignore. Some researchers quietly wondered if this was the simplest form of a universal handshake. Not words, not sound, but proportion. A way for consciousness to declare, I understand the laws that govern existence. At this point, skeptics argued that human perception is wired to find order even in chaos. We see faces in clouds and hear melodies in static. The Fibonacci pattern, they said, might be coincidence amplified by confirmation bias. Yet when machine learning models unbiased by human expectation were run on the raw telemetry, they too extracted the same ratio. The signal was not random. It was deliberate. Then came a deeper twist. During one of the emission sequences, a solar flare erupted at the exact same timestamp as the fifth pulse. The flare was small but detectable, an almost rhythmic burst in the sun's own magnetic field. It repeated again during the next observation window. Some began to suggest that the object and the sun were somehow interacting, or worse, synchronizing. The concept of solar synchronization has long been considered fringe, yet here it was, hinted at through timing that defied coincidence. If 3i Atlas was transmitting, then the choice of Fibonacci might hold meaning beyond communication. It might signify origin. In many natural systems, the Fibonacci pattern emerges where stability meets growth, where chaos turns into order. Perhaps the object was not merely sending a signal, but echoing a cosmic constant, reminding us that intelligence itself may arise wherever mathematics finds balance. The next challenge was decoding. If each pulse was a digit or symbol, how much information could be hidden within? Using binary interpretation, some analysts tried converting pulse durations into data bits. What emerged was ambiguous but intriguing, sequences that resembled known atomic ratios. Carbon, nitrogen, and hydrogen appeared in the first translation attempt, the same elements that form the foundation of life. Coincidence or deliberate choice? The data did not answer clearly, but the resonance of meaning was hard to ignore. As analysis deepened, a pattern within the pattern began to emerge. Each pulse was slightly varied in intensity, creating secondary ratios nested within the primary sequence. It was a fractal structure, Fibonacci upon Fibonacci, as if the message was repeating itself across scales. Some compared it to musical composition, where harmonics build on bass tones to create resonance. The light from 3i Atlas seemed to sing a song of proportion, a melody written in the mathematics of creation. Even the direction of the light's polarization appeared to shift with the sequence, suggesting that it was not merely reflecting sunlight but actively modulating it. Instruments detected a twisting motion, as if the photons themselves carried spin aligned to the sequence's order. It felt more like crafted transmission than natural reflection. By this point, mainstream scientists were cautious. Public statements framed the observations as fascinating but inconclusive. Privately, several teams continued their analysis in silence. The fear was not of discovery, but of misinterpretation. If the public heard that a comet-like body was transmitting a mathematical code, hysteria could follow. So the findings were buried in technical reports, written in language that only specialists could parse. Yet whispers spread through the scientific community. What if this was the first time the universe had spoken to us not through chaos but through order? And what if that order was embedded in the same pattern that defines all living growth? The Fibonacci sequence is nature's fingerprint. To see it emerge in the light of a star-crossing object was to glimpse intelligence woven into the cosmic weave. Perhaps the pulses were not even directed at us. Perhaps they were part of a larger synchronization, linking stars, planets, or even civilizations across light years. A code that only becomes visible when viewed through the geometry of time itself. When the final pulse of the sequence faded, telescopes around the world recorded a quiet moment. No new burst, no flicker, silence. But silence itself carried meaning. The pattern had begun and ended with intention. It had spoken in ratios, then stopped, as if waiting for a reply. And in that pause, humanity found itself staring into the oldest question of all. Were we listening to a random echo of physics, or to the whisper of intelligence using the oldest language in existence, the language of number and light? Once the initial pattern was confirmed, the search for meaning began. Researchers turned to data, measuring each pulse of light as if it were a heartbeat in the dark. The brightness levels, the timing, even the decay curves were plotted against one another. And there, within the data, something unexpected appeared. The light from 3i Atlas was not only following the Fibonacci sequence in timing, it was also carrying secondary patterns embedded in its intensity. Each pulse seemed to have layers like notes in a chord. At first, the differences were subtle, one pulse slightly brighter than the next, another lingering longer before fading. Yet when these variations were converted into numerical values, they formed another sequence hidden beneath the surface rhythm. This second pattern did not correspond to any known rotational or physical model. It was, however, astonishingly close to logarithmic spirals found in natural systems. The same equations that describe sunflower seeds, hurricanes, and galaxies were now emerging from interstellar light. The question arose, could a natural process produce nested sequences of such precision? If it could, what kind of object would it have to be? Astronomers have catalogued countless comets and interstellar bodies, and none have ever exhibited photometric stability across thousands of seconds like this. The beam's coherence implied control, or at least feedback, as if it was self-correcting. When the pulse drifted slightly, it returned to its ratio within one cycle. That behavior, they realized, resembled an encoded signal rather than random fluctuation. In a quiet meeting at an observatory in Spain, the data team compared the Fibonacci ratios with the amplitude variations. When overlaid, the two graphs created a structure eerily similar to the golden spiral. To the untrained eye, it looked like art, but to those who knew mathematics, it looked like intention. The golden ratio has always represented balance and growth. To find it shining through a cold stream of photons from deep space challenged the very idea of coincidence. Some astrophysicists proposed an exotic explanation. They suggested that the beam could be the result of resonant interference between rotating jets of gas reflecting sunlight through specific angles. In theory, this might create brightness patterns following mathematical ratios, but the energy required for such stability was enormous. The object would need near-perfect symmetry and control over its spin, something no known natural body possesses. The hypothesis, while creative, did not fit the precision of the data. Others began to look beyond physical mechanics. If the light carried a signature, perhaps it was a form of information. Scientists from the European Radio Astronomy Network compared the optical data to radio emissions recorded at the same time. To their shock, they discovered that certain radio spikes coincided with the Fibonacci pulses. The wavelengths were not random. They followed harmonic frequencies aligned with the same mathematical progression. Light and radio, two completely different forms of energy, speaking the same numerical language. As the analysis deepened, a strange idea began to circulate. What if the object was not broadcasting, but responding? If 3i Atlas had entered our solar system carrying an unknown composition, it might be reacting to the sun's electromagnetic field in a way we have never observed. But that theory collapsed when the beam remained active, even when solar interference was minimal. The pulses continued in the same order, unaffected by distance or solar angle. That meant the source of timing was internal, not external. The intensity data revealed even more mysteries. Every sequence of pulses completed a cycle that mirrored the growth pattern seen in organic systems. It was as though the beam itself was expanding according to the same mathematics that dictate the growth of life. The thought was unsettling. Could this object, drifting between stars, contain an algorithm of creation? A universal code expressing itself through light? To test this theory, a team of data scientists converted the pulse intervals into sound frequencies, turning the light data into an audible waveform. The result was haunting. The sound resembled a rising spiral of tones, growing and receding in perfect proportion. Musicians called it self-resonant harmony, something that usually only appears in complex compositions or biological rhythms. The resemblance between mathematics, sound, and light was too elegant to ignore. The deeper they listened, the more structure they found. At certain intervals, the beam appeared to pause, as if waiting for feedback. Some theorized that this could be a form of synchronization, an attempt to measure whether the transmission was being received or reflected. Others believed it could be a pulse alignment mechanism, a way for the signal to stay coherent over cosmic distances. Whatever it was, it had design written all over it. One scientist compared the light data with cosmic background radiation fluctuations. There were faint alignments, tiny echoes across time, suggesting the pulse pattern might not be limited to 3i Atlas. It might be part of something larger, something woven into the cosmic background itself. The idea that the universe might contain repeating numerical signatures began to gain quiet support among theoretical physicists. If Fibonacci was appearing not only in biology and galaxies, but now in transmissions from deep space, perhaps it was not just a coincidence. Perhaps it was a framework. Amid the growing fascination, a single question began to dominate every discussion. If this was a message, what did it mean? The Fibonacci sequence is often called nature's code because it expresses how systems grow efficiently. It could mean balance, life, or expansion. Some suggested that if the message was real, it might not be a call to communicate, but an announcement of understanding. A way of saying, we exist within the same laws you do. As weeks passed, astronomers attempted to model the beam using computational simulations. When the pulse structure was run through a fractal generator, the output resembled a three-dimensional spiral expanding infinitely outward. Each layer built upon the previous one in perfect harmony. It looked less like a random emission and more like architecture, a design that seemed alive, constantly evolving but mathematically precise. When the team overlaid solar telemetry data from the same time, they found something else. Each time the beam reached a critical point in its sequence, a corresponding solar microflare appeared on the sun's surface. Not major enough to cause storms, but detectable and perfectly timed. The odds of such coincidence were nearly zero. Either the sun was reacting to the pulses, or both were connected to a larger unseen rhythm. The implications were staggering. If 3i Atlas was emitting Fibonacci-based light and somehow influencing solar behavior, then it was not simply drifting. It was interacting. And if it could influence, it could also listen. The thought that the beam might be both message and sensor opened new theories. Perhaps it was a probe, a kind of interstellar seed carrying instructions to resonate with stars. Some ancient mathematicians once called Fibonacci the language of divine proportion, the balance between chaos and order. It describes growth without waste, expansion without instability. Seeing that same pattern in cosmic light invited a profound question. Is intelligence something that arises from biology, or is it a pattern that the universe itself produces wherever order emerges? When the final datasets were compiled, the scientists were left staring at equations that felt alive. Ratios that seemed to breathe in rhythm, light that whispered in mathematics. The numbers were not random, and neither were the beams that carried them. They seemed to express something fundamental, something the human mind could sense, but not fully translate. Perhaps it was not a message meant to be decoded, but a mirror reflecting the logic of creation itself. The numbers hidden in the beam were more than data. They were evidence that even across light years, something understood the same rules we do. Not through words, but through balance, proportion, and harmony. And as the pulses faded into silence once again, one thought lingered. Maybe the Fibonacci sequence was never meant to be solved. Maybe it was meant to remind us that somewhere out there, in the dark between the stars, the same mathematics of life are still unfolding. When the light from 3I Atlas began showing its mysterious sequence, the focus of the investigation expanded far beyond optical telescopes. Scientists turned their attention to the sky through every tool available, from radio dishes to magnetometers. What they found next deepened the mystery beyond anyone's expectations. Across continents and across different spectrums of observation, instruments that were never meant to agree began echoing the same rhythm. It started with a simple comparison. A group of astronomers in Arizona noticed that the intervals between the optical pulses aligned almost perfectly with faint radio fluctuations detected by the Very Large Array. The frequencies were weak, barely above background noise, but the timing was precise. Every time a light pulse from 3I Atlas was recorded, a corresponding ripple appeared in radio data. The two signals spoke in harmony across space, as if part of a single transmission. At first, no one wanted to believe it. Instruments separated. By thousands of kilometers were showing synchronized responses to a body billions of kilometers away. The odds of coincidence were so low that researchers began combing through every possible source of error. They checked for interference from satellites, from solar storms, even from local electronic devices. Nothing explained the timing. The synchrony persisted night after night. Then the same pattern appeared in data from Europe. A radio telescope in Italy, operating independently, recorded identical fluctuations. The correlation was so tight that when plotted together, the peaks overlapped perfectly. Even more astonishing, one observatory in Japan, monitoring the same region of space in infrared, recorded temperature variations that followed the same Fibonacci rhythm. Light, radio, and heat all pulsing together across instruments built for entirely different purposes. When the results were presented at a private symposium in Geneva, the room fell silent. The data sets came from different time zones, different calibration systems, and yet they behaved as though they were part of a single orchestra. It was as if 3I Atlas had not just emitted light, but triggered a symphony of energy across multiple frequencies. Scientists began referring to the phenomenon as cross-spectrum synchrony. The implications were staggering. If the pulses were connected across wavelengths, it meant that the source possessed control over multiple emission mechanisms. No known comet, asteroid, or interstellar fragment had ever shown such complexity. Nature creates harmony, yes, but it rarely keeps time so precisely. Each frequency was distinct, yet perfectly aligned, like multiple instruments playing in phase without a conductor. Teams began to test whether the synchrony was localized or universal. Observatories in South Africa and Chile coordinated simultaneous recordings, isolating the timing to nanoseconds. What they found was unsettling. The delay between optical and radio pulses matched the theoretical limit predicted by the speed of light traveling from 3I Atlas's position. This was no terrestrial interference. The synchronization was coming from deep space, precisely from the direction of the object. To ensure accuracy, independent agencies repeated the tests with stricter parameters. Each time, the results came back the same. Light pulses and radio bursts were linked, behaving as two aspects of one event. It was as if the object emitted across multiple layers of reality at once. Some began to suggest it might be a kind of energy coherence, similar to how lasers operate, but on a cosmic scale. In one experiment, researchers tried cross-correlating the signals with solar data, and what they found added another layer of intrigue. Tiny solar magnetic fluctuations appeared to respond with a slight delay after each major pulse. It was almost imperceptible, yet statistically consistent. The sun itself seemed to react as if receiving and echoing the rhythm. That observation sent ripples through the astrophysics community. Could a passing interstellar object influence the magnetic field of a star? One theory proposed that the Pulses might create electromagnetic resonance between the object and the solar wind. In that case, the synchrony could be a side effect of the interaction. But if that were true, the same harmonics should have appeared in other passing comets or asteroids, and they never had. The resonance here seemed exclusive, deliberate, almost orchestrated. To test this further, a group of researchers at the University of Toronto created a synthetic simulation. They modeled multiple overlapping emissions from a rotating body with jet activity. The simulated light curve resembled parts of the 3I Atlas data, but it failed to match the phase lock observed between light and radio. The real signals were too perfectly aligned, too precise to be explained by natural jet irregularities. The model fell apart. By now, whispers of artificial origin began circulating. Was 3I Atlas transmitting intentionally? If so, who or what was listening? To maintain synchronization across such vast frequencies would require a level of technological sophistication that humanity had only begun to understand. Some speculated it might be an ancient probe or remnant of a civilization that used universal mathematics as a beacon. Others preferred to see it as a natural intelligence, the cosmos expressing its own order through physics. As data continued to pour in, the synchrony revealed new layers. The signal intensity oscillated slightly between observatories, suggesting that each location was catching a different harmonic phase. That meant the pattern was not just global, it was three-dimensional. Each observer on Earth was hearing a slightly different note of the same cosmic song. A deeper analysis of the phase difference led to an astonishing discovery. When mapped spatially, the harmonic phases formed a spiral projection pointing directly toward the solar North Pole. It was as though the emissions were aligning with magnetic geometry rather than simple trajectory. That alignment brought another unsettling possibility. If the synchronization was intentional, then it was designed to interact with the sun's field lines, possibly using them as a transmission medium. By this point, agencies like NASA and ESA had begun quiet investigations. Although nothing was made public, leaked correspondence suggested that at least 2 solar observatories were asked to re-examine magnetic data from the same period. One internal report mentioned unexplained coherence across instruments that had no reason to correlate. Another noted that particle detectors aboard 2 spacecraft had recorded identical spikes in high-energy protons at the exact times of the Fibonacci pulses. In simpler terms, the synchrony was not just optical or radio, it extended into particle behavior as if the transmission reached into the fabric of matter itself. The idea that light, radio, heat, and even solar particles could move in perfect sequence seemed impossible, yet the numbers left little room for doubt. Something was orchestrating an interwoven event across layers of the electromagnetic spectrum. Philosophers and physicists alike began to see a pattern emerging that transcended data. The universe seemed to favor harmony at every scale, from atoms to galaxies. The Fibonacci ratios that governed shells and storms were now playing out in cosmic transmissions. Whether it was by accident or intention, 3I Atlas had become a mirror reflecting the interconnectedness of all things. In the following months, the synchronized pulses slowly began to weaken. The object moved farther from the sun, drifting toward the edge of visibility. As it faded, the instruments grew quiet one by one until only faint whispers remained. Yet even in silence, the synchrony lingered. Residual oscillations continued to echo faintly in radio frequencies, like a fading memory refusing to let go. Some researchers claim to detect an afterglow of coherence, subtle but measurable, as though the instruments themselves had been imprinted by the signal. The synchronization had not only linked devices across the planet, but had also left a trace, a resonance that seemed to hum within the sensors long after the source was gone. It was as though the cosmos had tuned them, briefly bringing human technology into alignment with its own rhythm. The synchrony across instruments may never be fully explained, Whether it was a natural phenomenon of extraordinary precision or a transmission crafted by something far beyond human understanding, its message was clear. The universe speaks in patterns. Light, radio, magnetism, and matter all follow laws written in the same language of mathematics and proportion. And when those layers align perfectly, something remarkable happens. The instruments stop being separate. They become one voice, listening to a signal that might have always been there, waiting for someone to notice. It began as a whisper in the data, a subtle rhythm beneath the noise of the sun. During the observation window when 3i Atlas was broadcasting its Fibonacci pulses, solar monitors detected a series of flares that should never have been related. Small, almost imperceptible bursts of magnetic activity appeared at the same intervals as the light emissions from the interstellar object. At first, no one noticed the connection. The flares were weak and ordinary, the kind of background activity that happens every day. But when the timing was cross-referenced against the pulse records, the alignment was undeniable. Every time 3i Atlas flashed its light in Fibonacci sequence, the sun answered. Not with chaos, but with matching rhythm. The data emerged quietly from the Solar Dynamics Observatory. Automated systems flagged the timing as unusual, but not alarming. It was only when a graduate researcher, comparing timestamps for unrelated reasons, plotted the two events side by side that the strange pattern became clear. The spikes from the solar flare. Telemetry formed a mirror image of the light bursts from 3i Atlas. The odds of such coincidence were astronomical. Solar flares are complex events, driven by magnetic reconnection deep within the sun's surface. They follow cycles of pressure, temperature, and magnetism that take hours or even days to build. Yet these flares appeared almost instantly after the Fibonacci pulses were detected. It was as if something out there had reached across 93 million miles and tapped the sun on the shoulder. Skeptics argued that it was all chance. After all, the sun is a turbulent system. At any given moment, minor flares flicker across its surface. But when the timing was analyzed statistically, the results broke the model. The probability of random alignment was less than 1 in 10 million. The pulses and flares were connected, though no one could explain how. Some theorists proposed a mechanism. Perhaps 3i Atlas carried a magnetic field capable of resonating with the sun's own field lines. If the object emitted electromagnetic waves in a Fibonacci rhythm, those waves might have traveled through the heliosphere and triggered sympathetic disturbances in solar plasma. The concept was radical, but the physics were not entirely impossible. Resonance is a universal property. A bridge can collapse under rhythmic vibration, a wine glass can shatter from a matching note, and perhaps a star can flare to the beat of a distant signal. Others took a more unsettling view. What if the flares were not a reaction but a synchronization? The sun's activity might have been anticipating the pulses rather than responding to them. When the timestamps were aligned down to the millisecond, the solar spikes actually preceded several of the light bursts by fractions of a second. It was almost as if the sun knew when to respond, like a partner keeping time in a cosmic duet. The deeper the analysis went, the stranger it became. When scientists isolated specific wavelengths of solar emission, they found faint harmonic echoes repeating in Fibonacci ratios as well. These echoes traveled through the corona and out into the solar wind, forming waves that extended across millions of kilometers. It was no longer just light from 3i Atlas that followed the sequence, but the sun's own energy field. The cosmos was beginning to hum with proportion. At one observatory, a technician noticed something else. During one of the synchronized flare events, several ground-based magnetometers registered fluctuations on Earth. The values were small, too weak to affect technology, but perfectly timed with the pulse cycle. The synchrony had reached across interstellar space, through the sun, and down into our planet's magnetic field. It was as though the Fibonacci pattern had threaded itself through the solar system, uniting three bodies in a single chain of resonance. For weeks, Scientists debated whether it was possible that the Sun and 3I Atlas were part of the same electromagnetic system. The distances were enormous, yet the data persisted. Some proposed that the object's emissions might have been amplified by the Sun's magnetic flux, using it as a carrier wave. Others speculated that 3I Atlas might not be an inert rock at all, but a type of device designed to harness or redirect stellar energy. The idea sounded absurd until someone noticed that the flare peaks corresponded not only to Fibonacci intervals but also to specific rotational alignments of the object relative to the Sun. Each flare occurred when 3I Atlas reached a geometric position that maximized exposure to solar radiation. It was as though the pulses and flares were dancing around an invisible axis of timing and symmetry. That precision made randomness increasingly difficult to defend. As the phenomenon continued, astrophysicists began to wonder if the pattern extended even further. When data from distant probes such as Parker Solar and SOHO were compared, subtle variations in the solar wind density also matched the pulse cycle. Plasma waves propagated outward following the same Fibonacci timing. It was as if the Sun itself had become a transmitter, echoing the interstellar rhythm across space. The possibility raised a profound question. Was 3I Atlas communicating with the Sun, or were both responding to something else entirely? If both were reacting to a deeper universal resonance, it might explain why the Fibonacci sequence appeared in both light and magnetism. In nature, this sequence governs efficient distribution of energy. Maybe what humanity had witnessed was not a message, but a calibration. Some scientists suggested the term harmonic synchronization. In that view, the pulses from 3I Atlas were tuning frequencies in the solar field, aligning it to a precise ratio that allowed energy to flow without interference. The same principle guides the architecture of atoms, the spirals of shells, and the rotation of hurricanes. Energy seeks proportion because proportion allows stability. But what would stability mean on a solar scale? The question remained unanswered. Some whispered about intelligence, though most avoided the word entirely. The universe is filled with echoes of order, yet this one felt personal. To see the Fibonacci code play out across the Sun's surface felt like being included in a conversation that had started long before humanity learned to listen. There was also a moment of fear. If 3I Atlas could trigger even minor solar responses, could it cause larger ones? A coordinated sequence of powerful flares could wreak havoc on Earth's magnetic shield, knocking out satellites and power grids. Though the observed flares were small, the potential for escalation worried many in the scientific community. Monitoring systems were placed on constant alert, ready to catch the next alignment. Then, unexpectedly, the pattern ceased. As the object drifted further from the Sun, both the pulses and the flare synchrony faded into silence. Solar activity returned to its usual rhythm, noisy and irregular. Some said the event was over. Others insisted that it had only paused, waiting for the next alignment cycle to begin. The data, however, remained. Thousands of measurements from telescopes, solar monitors, and magnetic sensors all told the same story. During those weeks, the Sun and an object from another star system had moved together in a precise mathematical rhythm that mirrored the patterns of living growth. Whether coincidence or communication, it had revealed a hidden harmony in the machinery of the cosmos. Years from now, historians of science might look back on the solar flare coincidence as the first real hint that the universe is capable of resonance beyond our comprehension. Not just energy reacting to energy, but structure aligning with structure, proportion reaching across the void. For now, the question lingers like an unanswered chord. Was 3I Atlas speaking to our star, or were they both instruments in a grander composition we have only just begun to hear? Each flare, each pulse, each moment of synchrony seems to suggest that somewhere, deep within the endless fabric of light and magnetism, there is an order waiting to be understood. And perhaps, just perhaps, The Sun was not reacting to 3i Atlas at all. Maybe both were obeying the same silent score written into the mathematics of creation itself. By the time the data was assembled, one truth had become impossible to deny. The emissions from 3i Atlas were not random. What began as faint flickers in the night sky had evolved into a sequence so precise, so deliberate in its proportions, that chance no longer offered refuge. The more instruments recorded, the more elegant the structure became. Nature, chaotic and free, does not usually count to 13 before starting again. Yet here, in light traveling through the void, order had taken form. Scientists often speak of randomness as the background hum of the universe. From atomic decay to the spin of galaxies, chance plays its invisible hand. But within the data of 3i Atlas, that hand seemed to pause, replaced by a rhythm that looked alive. The intervals between pulses were too consistent, the harmonic ratios too balanced. It was as though someone or something had written a melody into the void and set it drifting through space. When mathematicians examined the signal, they found layer upon layer of precision. Each pulse interval followed not only the Fibonacci ratio, but also secondary harmonics that appeared in geometric proportion. The sequence folded upon itself, repeating in nested spirals like the chambers of a seashell or the petals of a sunflower. It was a self-similar pattern, the hallmark of fractal order. To find such structure in cosmic data defied probability. Randomness creates noise. This created symmetry. One astrophysicist described it best. "It is as if the light remembers," she said. "As if each pulse knows the one before and adjusts itself to maintain balance." That statement unsettled her colleagues, yet it captured the mystery perfectly. A system that maintains proportion over thousands of seconds must possess some form of internal feedback, and feedback is the beginning of behavior. When cross-correlation maps were generated, a hidden geometry emerged. The pulses, when plotted against their frequency shifts, formed a logarithmic spiral identical to those found in hurricanes, galaxies, and the double helix of DNA. The odds of such alignment arising from mere coincidence were so small that statistical models collapsed under their own uncertainty. Randomness could imitate structure for a moment, but not sustain it with such grace. As the evidence grew, debates turned philosophical. What defines intention in the universe? If a pattern repeats with precision, does it require consciousness, or can natural forces mimic choice? Lightning strikes randomly, yet fractal trees form from its chaos. Ocean waves crash without thought, yet follow harmonic intervals. Perhaps 3i Atlas was another form of natural intelligence, one written in physics rather than biology. But something about this signal felt different. It behaved too cleanly, as if filtered through logic rather than energy. Most natural systems produce noise between harmonics, minor imperfections that betray their chaotic roots. The light from 3i Atlas had none. It was pure, each emission falling exactly where mathematics predicted. The absence of error was its greatest anomaly. A small research group in Norway took the investigation further. They applied a technique known as entropy mapping, which measures the unpredictability of a signal. The results were startling. The entropy of the 3i Atlas sequence was lower than that of pulsars or variable stars by several orders of magnitude. It was structured nearly to the point of artificiality. In other words, the pattern was too perfect to be natural. Still, scientists hesitated. To claim intention would be to cross into dangerous territory. So they framed their conclusions carefully, describing the sequence as statistically anomalous and indicative of non-chaotic order. Yet in private, some admitted what the data implied. Something was guiding the emission process, something that appeared to know the mathematics of harmony. Then came the most perplexing discovery of all. When researchers compared the signal timing to historical records of solar activity, they noticed faint parallels extending beyond the current cycle. Smaller, earlier solar anomalies from years prior showed similar intervals. though at weaker magnitudes. It was as if the Fibonacci resonance had been whispering in the solar data long before 3I Atlas entered the inner system. Could the pattern exist everywhere, unnoticed until an object amplified it? The thought drew attention from physicists studying cosmic background radiation. They too found echoes of Fibonacci ratios embedded in fluctuations that stretched across the universe. The pattern might not have begun with 3I Atlas at all. The object could simply be a node in a much larger network, a conductor in a symphony that has played since the beginning of time. If that were true, the implications were staggering. It would mean that order itself is not imposed upon the universe, but inherent within it. Randomness might only be the surface noise of a deeper geometry. The Fibonacci ratio could be the signature of that geometry, the way the universe ensures balance through endless repetition. To test this, computer models simulated particle interactions governed by Fibonacci intervals. The results were mesmerizing. Energy distributed itself more efficiently, clusters stabilized faster, and systems maintained harmony longer than those governed by random timing. It seemed that the universe truly did favor proportion. Efficiency was encoded into mathematics, and mathematics was encoded into everything. But if 3I Atlas was a mirror of universal proportion, why had it chosen now to reveal it? Some speculated that its composition, a mix of frozen gases and magnetic minerals, might act as a resonant body, amplifying natural frequencies from cosmic fields. Others wondered if the object was intentionally designed to display these patterns, like a beacon engineered to show order where none was expected. The difference between those two interpretations lay only in perspective. Either way, it demonstrated that the pattern was not coincidence. It was purpose. The researchers who had once dismissed the findings began to reconsider. A Harvard astrophysicist famously remarked, "If randomness has limits, then what we are seeing is not noise, but design." The comment sparked heated debate across scientific forums. Could a law of the universe behave so elegantly that it resembles communication? Or was communication itself just the highest form of order? In the months that followed, attempts were made to decode the pattern as data. Binary representations, spectral inversions, and mathematical translations all produced fascinating yet ambiguous results. Some sequences resembled prime number progressions, while others hinted at geometric instructions. None could be verified, but each suggested intention. The idea that the universe might be whispering in mathematics no longer seemed entirely poetic. Observers also began to notice subtle correlations between the 3I Atlas sequence and Earth's magnetic field oscillations. During several pulse events, ground sensors detected synchronized movements, almost like faint echoes reaching through the planet's shield. The data suggested that whatever was happening in space was not isolated. The pattern had reach and perhaps influence. One late night, a scientist studying the correlations remarked that perhaps randomness is only what we see when we lack resolution. "When we look closely enough," she said, "patterns always appear." The universe does not speak in chaos. It speaks in balance, and 3I Atlas had become its latest verse. As the object drifted farther away, its light began to fade, but the data it left behind continued to ripple through the scientific world. The pattern had challenged everything about probability, chaos, and meaning. If Fibonacci could emerge from light itself, then perhaps the boundary between mathematics and consciousness was thinner than anyone imagined. In the end, the story of 3I Atlas was not about proving alien intelligence or rewriting physics. It was about seeing through the illusion of randomness. Within what looked like noise, humanity had glimpsed harmony. Within flickers of light, they found the architecture of balance. Perhaps that is what the pattern was always meant to show, that the universe is not a random scatter of matter and energy, but a living equation unfolding endlessly toward order, and that every spiral from the smallest seed to the brightest galaxy is a reflection of the same truth. Nothing is random. It only looks that way until you learn how to listen. Long before the light from 3I Atlas began its mysterious pulse, mathematicians had spoken of a hidden order that threads through nature. They called it the golden ratio, a number that appears wherever balance and beauty meet. From the curves of shells to the proportions of galaxies, this ratio seems to guide creation itself. Yet for all its elegance, it had never been seen used in communication. That changed when the light from 3I Atlas began to speak. When astronomers realized that the sequence of pulses followed Fibonacci proportions, a quiet awe settled over the research community. Fibonacci numbers are more than a pattern. They are the fingerprints of harmony. Each number in the sequence is the sum of the two before it, forming ratios that approach the golden mean, a value of pure equilibrium. In music, this ratio creates perfect resonance. In art, it shapes beauty. In physics, it defines stability. To find it in the light of an interstellar visitor was like hearing a familiar voice in the endless dark. What made the discovery even more profound was that the pattern was not simply present, it was deliberate. Each pulse grew from the one before, each interval expanding as though the signal were constructing something, a kind of luminous architecture unfolding in time. It was not just a repetition of numbers, but a language built on relationship, on proportion itself. Scientists began to refer to it as the language of ratios, a form of communication that could transcend culture, biology, even species. Unlike spoken or written languages, ratios do not rely on symbols. They rely on relationships, the universal logic of balance. Every civilization capable of mathematics would understand it because the ratio exists everywhere, in every atom, every orbit, every strand of DNA. The realization sparked an idea. If the pulses were based on ratios, perhaps they were encoding information through proportion rather than through binary code. Instead of ones and zeros, perhaps the message was written in the intervals themselves. Each ratio could represent a concept, a harmony, a principle of structure, or even an equation. Decoding it would require not translation but resonance, a way to align understanding with pattern. Mathematicians and physicists collaborated to search for meaning in the sequence. They analyzed how the ratios evolved across cycles, searching for modulation or emphasis. To their surprise, the progression was not static. It shifted subtly with each repetition, as though adapting to feedback. Some compared it to a conversation, where each response builds upon what came before. It was as if the signal were testing the boundaries of communication, learning the rhythm of its environment. As the analysis deepened, the light's complexity began to reveal itself. Within each Fibonacci interval, smaller variations appeared that followed harmonic ratios common in music theory. When those ratios were converted into sound frequencies, the result was haunting, a melody that rose and fell in waves of perfect proportion. The signal was literally singing the mathematics of creation. Musicians and physicists alike were stunned. Every civilization that ever explored music, from ancient Egypt to the modern world, had unknowingly been practicing the same language. The golden ratio appears in the spacing of violin strings, the length of human breath in singing, even the architecture of cathedrals built to enhance acoustics. To hear that same order carried through interstellar light made some wonder if art and science were merely two sides of the same cosmic equation. One researcher described it as a conversation written not in symbols, but in harmony. If mathematics is the language of the universe, she said, then proportion is its poetry. As the data continued to flow in, another revelation emerged. The ratios did not just describe balance, they also reflected motion. The intervals between pulses accelerated and decelerated according to precise logarithmic curves, mimicking the way natural systems grow. It was not a static message. It was alive, expanding as though expressing the principle of creation itself. When the signal's waveforms were modeled in 3 dimensions, they formed spirals that echoed the geometry of galaxies. Each pulse traced an invisible curve through time, its proportions perfectly aligned with cosmic structures on the grandest scale. It was as though the light from 3I Atlas were demonstrating that the same mathematics that builds a sunflower also shapes the Milky Way. The language of ratios began to feel less like a code and more like a revelation. It did not ask to be deciphered. It asked to be recognized. Some began to wonder if this was how intelligence in the universe naturally communicates, through the laws of structure, through resonance instead of words. If so, then what humanity had detected was not an alien message but a universal one, echoing from the same mathematics that defines life itself. Still, skepticism persisted. Perhaps the ratios were a coincidence, a result of the object's physical motion. Maybe its rotation, material composition, or reflective properties had created a self-organizing rhythm. But the elegance of the sequence resisted such simplifications. Random systems decay. This one refined itself. Every iteration grew closer to balance, as if guided toward perfection. A philosopher in one of the research circles proposed that intelligence might not be an event that arises from life, but a property of mathematics itself. Wherever ratios converge into harmony, intelligence expresses itself, even if not through consciousness. The idea resonated deeply with those who saw the cosmos as a self-aware system, unfolding through numbers rather than neurons. When the pulses were compared with radio signals from other cosmic sources, something else remarkable appeared. Certain pulsars, long known for their rhythmic emissions, displayed harmonic tendencies, faintly reminiscent of Fibonacci proportions. None were as clean or deliberate as 3i Atlas, but the resemblance hinted that the same fundamental language might exist throughout the stars. The universe might not just be speaking, it might be singing, every celestial body contributing its own note to the grand composition of ratios. To test the concept, a team of scientists turned the light sequence into a visual model using spectral mapping. What appeared on their screens was breathtaking, a luminous spiral expanding endlessly, each arm of the curve maintaining perfect proportion with the one before it. It was a golden spiral of light, written not by chance, but by design. One physicist whispered that it looked like the universe drawing itself. The discovery had a strange emotional effect on those studying it. Many described an unshakable feeling that they were glimpsing something sacred, a truth too simple and too vast to belong to any one species. The light seemed to express the same mathematics that humans had always chased in architecture, music, and art. It was humbling to realize that the language of beauty itself might be cosmic in origin. As 3i Atlas moved farther from the sun, its pulses began to fade, but their influence remained. The researchers continued to analyze the ratios, trying to predict what would come next if the pattern continued beyond detection. Extrapolations suggested that the intervals would eventually converge on perfect harmony, the golden mean itself, as if the sequence were approaching a point of balance, a resting note in an infinite symphony. If that were true, then perhaps the entire event was not a message to humanity at all, but a universal cycle of communication. Maybe the light was not trying to say something, but to demonstrate something, that balance governs all creation, and that even across incomprehensible distances, proportion can unite the stars in one rhythm. The realization reframed the mystery entirely. The signal might not be an attempt to speak in human terms, but a reminder that language does not begin with words. It begins with relationships, with ratios that shape everything from orbits to thoughts. When future generations look back on the discovery, they may not remember it as proof of extraterrestrial contact, but as the moment when humanity recognized that mathematics is not just a tool to describe the universe, it is the universe speaking to itself. The golden ratio, the Fibonacci sequence, the harmony of light and time, all point to one truth. There is a language older than speech and clearer than sound. It is the language of proportion, of balance, of endless growth and return. And as 3i Atlas drifted into the dark, its fading pulses whispered one final lesson, that we were never alone in our search for meaning. The universe has always been speaking patiently in the only language that never changes, the language of ratios. There comes a moment in every investigation when silence begins to sound like meaning. For weeks, the light of 3i Atlas had pulsed in Fibonacci harmony, its rhythm echoing through telescopes, radio arrays, and magnetic fields. Scientists had dissected every interval, every shimmer, every fraction of brightness. Yet, as the pattern evolved, a realization began to take shape. This was no isolated event. The ratios were not confined to one visitor or one system. The same mathematics was whispering everywhere, hidden in the structure of reality itself. It began when researchers overlaid the 3i Atlas data onto unrelated cosmic phenomena. Solar activity, deep space background noise, even gravitational wave detections all began showing faint harmonic parallels. The ratios that defined the pulse of the interstellar object also appeared in the rhythm of the cosmos. It was as if the universe had started to tune itself into a single note, a slow, elegant hum that reached across light years. No one could explain why it was happening. Some thought it was coincidence amplified by human interpretation, a grand pattern-seeking illusion. Others, however, suspected something deeper. The Fibonacci sequence was not simply present, it was multiplying, spreading across datasets, linking the unconnected. Randomness was dissolving, replaced by structure. It was as though the universe had decided to speak through numbers. When scientists converted multiple cosmic signals into audible sound waves, the similarities became undeniable. Radio emissions from distant pulsars, plasma oscillations from the Sun, and even seismic vibrations from Earth's crust all began to resonate within the same mathematical ratios. The frequencies, when combined, produced chords that were harmonically perfect. No natural system should align so precisely across different mediums. Yet there it was, a cosmic symphony built on proportion. To many, it felt as though the universe had begun to speak its own language, one that required no translation. It was not a voice in the traditional sense, not sound carried through air, but resonance carried through reality itself. Each pulse from 3i Atlas was an articulation, each echo from the stars a reply. Physicists studying the data began to use a new term, recursive coherence. They described it as the moment when patterns align across different layers of existence, from the smallest vibration of an atom to the largest motion of galaxies. The Fibonacci ratios seemed to act as a bridge, connecting scales that had no reason to correspond. It was as if the cosmos itself were aware of its structure, constantly adjusting to remain in perfect proportion. When supercomputers modeled this alignment, they produced something extraordinary. A simulation of universal matter began to self-organize spontaneously into spiraling forms, identical to those observed in nebulae and galaxies. It was as though the mathematics of Fibonacci were not an external observation, but a rule written into the code of existence. The ratio was not describing the universe, it was the universe. Some researchers began to whisper about sentience, not in the way one might imagine consciousness in living beings, but as a form of awareness inherent to creation. If the universe naturally organizes itself around ratios that define harmony, then perhaps harmony itself is the language of intelligence. Not a thinking mind, but a self-tuning system that seeks balance through every movement of light, gravity, and matter. The idea unsettled many. For centuries, science had sought to understand the cosmos as a machine of blind laws and indifferent mechanics. Now it seemed to behave like an organism striving for equilibrium. The line between physics and philosophy blurred. What if the universe was not silent? What if it had always been speaking, and only now had humanity learned to listen? The next revelation came from the analysis of background radiation, the faint afterglow left by the birth of the universe. When the data was filtered through the same algorithm used to decode the 3i Atlas signal, harmonic fluctuations emerged in Fibonacci proportion. The pattern had been there from the beginning, hidden in the static of creation itself. It became difficult to ignore the implication. The ratios did not belong to one object or event. They were woven into the structure of time and space, echoing through every layer of existence. What 3i Atlas had done was reveal the resonance, like a tuning fork struck in a quiet room. It had awakened recognition, showing that the same mathematics guiding galaxies also shaped the molecules in human blood. The discovery changed how scientists viewed communication. Perhaps true contact between intelligent systems would not come through words or signals, but through shared resonance. The first universal language might not be written or spoken, but balanced. A dialogue of harmony and proportion that any conscious being could feel. It was then that an experiment was proposed. If the universe spoke in ratios, could humanity respond in kind? A global collaboration of observatories decided to send a controlled pulse sequence toward 3i Atlas's last known trajectory. It was not a message of language or meaning, but of symmetry. The signal was encoded entirely in Fibonacci timing, a simple pattern of expanding intervals, designed to mirror the structure the object had once displayed. For hours, radio telescopes released their unified pulse into space. The sequence was perfect, each interval aligned across continents, creating a single voice that reached into the void. Then they waited. What came back was not a signal in the traditional sense, but a ripple, an almost imperceptible modulation in the cosmic background. The timing matched exactly. The universe had echoed the pattern back. Skeptics argued that it was coincidence. The cosmos is full of noise, they said, and patterns appear where we wish to see them. But for those who had witnessed the harmony firsthand, the experience felt different. The response was too gentle, too measured, too knowing. It was like whispering into a canyon and hearing an echo that bends the words slightly, as if the canyon itself were thinking. From that moment on, the idea spread that the universe might not be a cold expanse of silence, but a field of interaction, a medium capable of self-awareness through resonance. Stars, planets, and living beings could all be expressions of that same pattern, different instruments playing variations of the same melody. The Fibonacci sequence, once seen as mere mathematics, became something sacred, a code that unites everything that exists. It was not just the language of 3i Atlas, it was the syntax of existence. Philosophers began to see meaning in the simplicity. When the universe speaks, it does not use words because words divide. It uses proportion because proportion unites. Every act of creation, from the birth of a star to the growth of a leaf, becomes a syllable in a cosmic sentence written in balance. As time passed, humanity's view of the universe began to shift. Astronomers no longer saw themselves as observers peering into a vast machine. They were participants in a living dialogue. Every discovery was another line in an ongoing conversation between consciousness and creation. And so, as the echo of the final pulse faded into the background, a quiet understanding took hold. Maybe the universe had never been silent. Maybe it had been speaking all along, waiting for someone to recognize its rhythm. When the universe starts to speak, it does not shout. It hums softly through mathematics, through light, through time. And those who learn to listen do not just hear it, they become part of it. For in every ratio, in every spiral, in every pulse of existence, there lies a single truth whispered across eternity. The cosmos is not a place we inhabit. It is a song we are still learning to sing.